Welcome everyone to this session of FEM 2020. When we talk about gender and women and health, one of the important things to discuss is what is gender, what is sex, what is sexuality, because we kind of assume a lot of things about it. And the best way to address that is to talk something about LGBTQI plus issues, which all discussion on the diverse ways in which gender and sexuality can manifest. For this, I invite the panelists for today's session. This is Dr. Kavita Arora, who is a child and adolescent mental health professional. Daniel Mendonca is one of those who have represented United Nations in 2014, and she holds a silver medal in Bachelor of Social Work from Mumbai University and is the first individual from LGBTQIA+ community to be awarded the Vidyarthi Bharati Ratna Award for Academics. So welcome, Daniel. Pooja Nair, who is a cis woman, chooses the pronoun she to describe herself. She has been a part of the non-profit sector for over a decade. She's a counselor, psychotherapist, and a faculty at Marivella Health Initiative's Pure Affirmative Counsel Practice Certificate course. Welcome, Pooja, to the panel. Dr. Chitra Selvan, she is an endocrinologist. She is an associate professor at Ramaiah Medical College. Welcome, Chitra. And then I would invite Dr. Geeta Chadda to put a light on this topic. Tell us what exactly we are going to discuss today. She works in the area of feminist science studies. And welcome, Geeta. Now I hand over the mic to you.
Thank you, Beena. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be part of thinking through FEM 2020 with you. For this session, I think, as you rightly said, one of the things that we need to ponder over very carefully is sex a purely biological construct based on genital, hormonal, and chromosomal manifestations and patterns? What and how is the normal, if I may put it in single quotes, sex of a body constructed? How are sex and gender related to each other? What is the role of medical science in reproducing heteronormative gender binaries? What are the dilemmas of the medical practitioner, as we are going to have this forum is initiated and probably will reach out to medical practitioners in dealing with these questions? And how can medical science further develop a gender sensitive approach in clinical practice, in research, and for me, most importantly, also how do we take it to pedagogic concerns? This panel of psychiatrists, as you've seen, counselors, activists, and endocrinologists discuss some of these questions. I'm hoping we'll discuss these questions from the standpoint of queer persons and from the perspectives of the queer movement in India. Our aim is actually to listen to each other and build conversations that might transform our understandings of sex, of gender, and of course the body. I've been part of various interdisciplinary dialogues, and I know that there are huge difficulties that we will encounter in an interdisciplinary dialogue, and also from multiple locations. These conversations are challenging. They raise questions of language, they raise questions of pushing convenient and disciplinary boundaries. So they are always beset with difficulties, but I'm hoping that, and I think Beena and I are on the same page on this one, that if we do this with care and mindfulness, I think these conversations could lead to a lot of transformation, both at the personal and at the political level. So I leave you here and very excited about listening to the panel of people who have done really significant and meaningful work in their areas. So welcome, Pooja, Daniel, Kavita, and Chitra. Take over, Pooja.
Thank you very much thank you, Dr. Bansal, for the introduction, of course, and also thank you, Dr. Chadda, for for raising certain questions, which means that I am not entering this space in an adversarial sort of preparation. I think the questions that you've raised have there is a sense of, you know, that care, the possibility that care can exist in this scenario, because I think there is something that happens before you can even imagine possibilities of care, and your questions have sort of assured me of that possibility. So thank you very much for that as well. Yes, so I'm here as, I mean, in terms of my location, I am a cis woman. So I happen to agree with the gender I was assigned. And that's what makes me cis. I'm lesbian. I was not okay with the sexuality that I was expected to conform to. I am by training a psychotherapist, and I'm also a queer affirmative, or you know, to say that I try to be queer affirmative. I'm always attempting to be queer affirmative, and I try to talk queer affirmative and raise those kinds of questions wherever, whichever space I'm part of. So that's about my location. When I was asked to be part of the panel, and I was given some description of also the title, that there was some bit of, I think, endocrinology or some medical terms there, I was frankly quite nervous. I also thought that, I mean, this is a biomedical space. There are biomedical experts, and I did not know how I would be able to sort of contribute or be part of this panel. And I also shared that with Dr. Bansal earlier. And then on second thought, I feel that I must be here. I deal on an everyday basis with distress that is systemic. I deal with distress that comes from structures. And if that's the case, and if what my client experiences as distress is caused by systems that so many of you are implicated in, so many of us are implicated in, I cannot not throw my hat in the ring. And that's how, you know, I also want to enter this space. And to begin with, say that what I draw on is knowledge that has come from years and years of resistance to structures. It's come from years of questioning the expert model, because the expert model is so top down. The expert model is so much about maintaining certain structures. So, you know, that relationship between structures and systems, and how systems help maintain structures. And therefore seeing that the knowledge there is problematic. And I would present an alternative to the kind of expert knowledge, to say that I consider knowledge from experience as valid knowledge too. Knowledge that comes from lived experience. And we know now from the margins, and if we don't know, it only means that we have either not listened or we have ignored. These are the only two possibilities, in my opinion. That knowledge from margins tells us that sex is not equal to gender, is not equal to sexuality. That the binary classification of sex, of bodies into only male or female bodies, the binary classification is what makes intersex abnormal, because we only have the reference point of two bodies. The binary of gender, which is tied to these two bodies, is what makes any other gender abnormal. The tying of sexuality then to a particular gender, and there's only one sexuality, I mean, there are not even two to go by, just heterosexuality, that tying that to gender and body is what makes every other sexuality abnormal. So these normative constructs make all other lived experiences and identities invalid and abnormal. Yeah. And which is, and that's why if you consider it abnormal, someone somewhere is going to find a fix for it. Someone somewhere is going to find a route to bring you back to normal. Yeah, and that's the whole conversion treatment thing we have all been grappling with. That's one. So I also want to clarify that I am speaking from a space that upholds three very specific values. There are more, but I will highlight only three right now. First one is of self-determination. That individuals, that one must uphold an individual's right to self-determination. Secondly, experience is knowledge. I'm not even saying that experience becomes knowledge through some methodological or epistemological processes. I'm saying experience is knowledge. That's the second one. And the third space that I come from is questioning and saying that normative is different from normal. Normal could just mean normative, and we say normal. And also when we say neutral, what we uphold is normative. So neutral could also mean normative. Yeah. So those are the spaces to clarify, spaces from where my questions sort of come from. And then to just close my sort of opening piece, I will say this: when it comes to bodies and genders on the margins, when we are talking trans persons, persons with intersex variations, we have to understand that needs of care and needs of cure will look very, very different. And if we are talking procedures that are affirmative, I see that as part of needs of care. Yeah, you have to at least get to the starting line that everybody else is standing on. You know, you have to at least be able to, as I said earlier, imagine possibilities of a fulfilling life, and you are standing miles behind those who are cis and those who do not have to question their gender. I am privileged. I am never going to be asked to show a certificate of my womanhood, yeah, which means my personhood. My personhood is not under question. And there are those who start miles behind it. So when we say affirmative procedures, you're not even providing cure, you're providing that fighting chance at a fulfilling life, so that all of us begin at the same starting line. It's about getting up to there. And I would define that as needs of care. And then also, how do we understand needs of cure? I mean, a queer person could also break a leg and need for you to fix it. Yeah. And to not collapse these two, to not collapse needs of care into curative pathological dimensions. And so just another sort of clarification or distinction or a separation that we have to make, because I think the most crucial part of affirmative work will be unlearning these connections that we so unthinkingly make, because all of us are implicated in the system and we internalize the system. So that's about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pooja. That in itself has evoked so much in me that I'm not sure where to go from here. I did think that I would speak a little bit more in terms of my experience as a medical professional in the field, but I really wish to go into some of the things that you've talked about. And I'm going to start with this question that you've brought up. And there are two questions that come from what you say. One is, who owns my gender? Yeah. So in whether it's our country or it's in the world, who owns it? I think specifically also in our culture, many people own me as a person. Whether it is about who's going to be my life partner, what school am I going to go into, what kind of education and subjects, a lot of it is owned by the collective. And that's how we are brought up. And often that includes my sexuality, which is very personal and intimate to me, but it is open to everyone. It also sometimes means my body image, whether I am okay as I am or not. So there are so many dialogues where we have, as a society, as structures, handed over our ownership to everyone and anyone. And when it comes to sexuality or my gender, the accountability is entirely the individual's. If you go wrong, it's your problem, it's your fault, you've got to fix it. But the ownership, when it comes to rights, is with the social structure. And I think this big gap is something that we don't even acknowledge. So only people who have lived and experienced this are able to see that these two are different things. And I think that's been my experience overall in my own journey in starting working with this. So I'll talk a little bit about that, because the second question that you evoked in me is who is the expert here? And I'll end with that and talk a little bit about it, because I'm touted as an expert. Often just by the sheer dint of having an MBBS and an MD degree, I'm told I'm an expert. And that's how someone approaches me. Am I the expert? I don't think so. Does that voice have any place in the larger this thing? That I don't think I'm the expert. It doesn't. So I'm starting from my journey. The books don't tell us, except in a small paragraph, about gender variation or diversity. Most of our MBBS and even MD in psychiatry, I'm not so sure about medicine and all, are Western written books. Some of them are Indian, rooted in Indian culture, but most of it is Western medicine. So the concepts of sexuality and gender have come to us often in our qualification and training, have often come from a Western concept. They have not come from our own Indian heritage, where actually there is far more evidence of fluid gender, fluid sexuality and orientations. But we don't study that. So our training does not comprise that. And way back in 1999, 98, my first experience was a young person who identified themselves as a male and came to me and said that my birth assigned gender was female, but I know I'm male, and will you help me? So I'm talking about 96, 97. I was a postgraduate student doing psychiatry, and I went to my seniors and I said, what do I do? I have never met anyone like this, and the books don't tell me much. At that point of time, if you remember, these guidelines, SOC, none of this existed. And my seniors told me, we also don't know too much. There is only one person in the entire faculty who knows a little bit about it because they've written an article on it. I went to them and we both decided that we are going to get trained from the expert, who is this individual. So I approached this young person and I said, will you help us? Because I don't know what this is. And you need my signature on something for surgery, which is what you have approached me with. But I have no knowledge, but you have posed me as an expert, or society or social structures. So can I learn with you? Because I need to understand. And that young person actually agreed to help me. So I had long conversations with them. And we actually admitted them in the inpatient ward with their consent, with the father. And they lived in the inpatient ward for 2 weeks. And every day I would sit down and I would speak to them. And that's where my journey started, when I realized that there's nothing in our training, nothing in the books that tells us the reality of what is. And over the years then, I have come to understand that what we are given degrees for, and supposedly we become experts because of those degrees, does not apply in this area at all. And therefore the question of who is the expert is often a dilemma that as a medical professional I face. I meet other medical professionals and they say, we know. So the second dilemma is about acknowledgement of an inherent bias of knowledge. And I'm going to say that again. And this existed in me as well. So I'm not saying this is not me, it's them, it's all of us. We are not even aware of the biases and stereotypes we have grown up with, and how harmful, even if unintentional, they are to the other, to someone who is impacted by our unawareness of these biases. And that develops into a huge dilemma once you become aware, because that brings me to the dilemma of then, what is my role? Am I just a psychiatrist? What am I treating really then? Because if I have come to believe that whether it is gender identity or it is sexual orientation or sexual preference, if that in itself is neither an illness nor a disorder, which is what I truly believe, it is self-owned and it is self-affirmed for me as well as for anyone else, then what am I treating? Why am I involved? Why is it medical? So I think that's the biggest question that all of us have to ask ourselves. So when somebody approaches me, what are you trying to do? Are you diagnosing a disorder? Are you treating a comorbid mental health possibility? Are you also an advocate because of where you're located? And I realized that more and more in the last few years, that I'm not a psychiatrist in that space only. If I'm aware that there is a social bias, then it also possibly becomes my role, if I'm willing to take it, that I have to be an advocate too. I have to provide an emotionally safe space for this individual to have an interface with someone who understands this. It is not about their illness, it's about the social illness. because I truly believe the problem is social. The problem most of the time comes, or the mental health suffers because of the interface between what the individual is experiencing and what society says you ought to do, and the definitions of that society and social structures that we grow up in. When that interface has to be navigated by a sole person for any kind of problem, you are setting, and we are setting the ground for mental health difficulties. They are not disorders in themselves. They are difficulties, they are problems, it's chronic stress, and it leads to a substrate of many different things, including an increased bullying, increased abuse, increased incidence of distress, of depression, of anxiety, possibly higher suicide rates, a feeling of being inadequate, a lower self-esteem. We are setting the grounds. Who's we? It's not the individual who's setting those grounds, it's the social structures and all of us. So if I'm willing to be a spectator to all of this, then my role can be limited only to a psychiatrist. And I say, well, you don't have a mental health illness. Thank you, bye-bye. And some of them only come to me for that. That's my experience. They just want to be told, I'm fine. I don't need to be fixed. And that's where my role ends. But what else? So over the years, I've realized that the dilemma comes with the fact that I can't fall back on knowledge. I can't fall back on training as a mental health professional. I don't know who the expert is in the field. I do not even know all my own biases, forget about acknowledging them and moving from them. The landscape and practices or standards of care are moving very fast. Our education, medical education, is not moving that fast. We are not making those practices as fast as actually the landscape is changing. So keeping up with recent advances is a big dilemma often. And then the dilemma of the role. Because this is an interdisciplinary process, and I realize that we are not, as a fraternity, as a medical fraternity, we are often not very collaborative from the point of view of interdisciplinary practices. We operate in silos, and the young person or the individual who's actually going to have to consult an endocrinologist, a mental health professional, often a therapist, as well as a psychiatrist, a surgeon, possibly somebody in plastics, possibly somebody, and I'm not even talking about, these are sometimes the related ones. I'm not even talking about a gynecologist, often a pediatrician, often, how do they navigate all of this alone? And whose role is it? Is it part of my role? And this is the question I often ask. Is it part of my role? Can I become an ally, an advocate, besides being a psychiatrist? And I think that's some of the parts of the journey that I have traveled. Those are the dilemmas. I often find some of my colleagues saying, I'd like to remain only a psychiatrist. I don't think I can become an advocate or an ally. It's too much work. I do feel somewhere we have to start questioning that. And I do feel that we have to acknowledge that the medical fraternity in itself has a role, because we are often the point of contact for individuals who have been marginalized by society, that there is no interface of society that can be approached. So I think locating ourselves in that role is something which is an ongoing dilemma for me. And I think it also ties into what I feel one can do as a medical professional. And I think the 2-3 things that I find very, very important, I'm not saying I'm good at it, but I think first of all, to keep yourself in a reflective space always, and to not own the expert position, especially in this field. To say that I need to learn more, I need to be open to learn more because things are changing. Secondly, to actually acknowledge your own bias and have the strength to do that, because unless one is able to acknowledge our own bias, we cannot move on, we cannot move further. And the third thing, according to me, is to actually be very clear in our minds, what are we diagnosing? Are we diagnosing something which is a consequence? Or are we saying that whether it is gender identity or sexual preference, or the adoption of a non-binary model? Are we saying that in itself sets someone apart and makes them abnormal? And I think that's the question that most medical professionals have to answer first. What are you diagnosing? What are you treating? Because unless we are clear about that, I don't think that we are going to have a very good plan of action. And I think that's always something that I recommend to anybody who asks me, my team members or my colleagues, that if you have arrived at a position after experience, we should share it. We should become advocates of that position as well, even if it is to raise questions and get questions raised at ourselves. So I think I'm going to stop here. Yeah, I think we can go on and on, but I'd really, really like to hear from Daniel a little bit more.
Thank you, Geeta ji, Pooja ji, and Kavita ji for taking this whole sum to a level where I think I can come in and speak. And so I would like to start saying that, you know, anything that we begin with treating people, it automatically becomes abnormal. And I think there where the definition need to change, that for LGBTIQ people, you don't need to treat them, you need to listen and understand them. You need to understand what's going on between their body, what's going on between their mind, because here the question is not just about, you know, sex reassignment surgery, gender binary, not fitting into gender, but the question is that individual versus the entire society in and around them. I may come to a psychiatric, I may take all the required needs, I may go to a psychologist, I may take all the required needs, but what once I'm out in that world? Out in that world with full of hatred, out in that world full of people judging me of being who I am, and out in that world of every time questioning my existence within myself. So like when I was born, even before I say I was born, what languages do the medical fraternity uses to address people is also one of the most important parts. Because I remember when I was born, I was nor male nor female, I was born intersex. And because of that, the terminology, the first that doctor used to my parents, and which is responsible for the entire separation of me and my parent, was कि आपके घर पे छक्का पैदा हुआ है. The word recently intersex is introduced now in 2014 when the UN fact sheet came into part, and I was privileged enough to be a part of that conference, and then the word I was introduced. But for still many medical fraternity till date, with even gynecologists and with even students studying in gynecologist department, people do not know the word intersex. And they do not know how to diagnose such children and what help should be given. For me, there was no choice, because the time I was born that way, my family just sold away to me, to the community, to the Ijda community. And because I was not considered to be normal by the majority, I had to grow up in that environment. And every time there was this constant, I knew I didn't fix in the box of a transgender. I knew I was not gay. I knew I was not lesbian. I didn't knew who I was. That concept when something happens and you don't know who you are is more scary than anything else. Because I went to many doctors, but nobody ever told me that this was me. Every time the word that was used for me, that you were hermaphrodite, you are a disorder. Like, so the term when disorder comes into being, you automatically start saying that this is something that can be treated because it's a disorder, right? So this is something that can be treated. And when treatment becomes an experimental part of the medical fraternity, it is more painful. I have gone through doctors fingering me, doing sort of unwanted things which I was not comfortable with, laughing at my bodical structures for being who I am. And that fear has always remained within me, because I cannot go to any doctor. I cannot approach any medical fraternity with the fear in my heart that I don't know what else will this person do with me, because this person makes me feel uncomfortable within the body that I am in. And every time, because I look like a male, I have a features of male, I've always been sent to a male fraternity rather than a female fraternity. And that also happens a lot of time to transgender people who identify themselves as women. They are always sent to male, and women who identify themselves as male are always sent to women. And this thing, I also remember, this is very personal, but this is open and out to the world. I was raped by 11 men at Bandra station because I was into begging and into prostitution. And I'm not ashamed of it, because this is how society made me dealt with, because there was no option for me to go forward to live a life. Today where I stand, it's because of a lot of friends, and it is because of a lot of people to be thankful to in this life. But when that happened, police, medical fraternity did not recognize my rape as rape. And the reason is because I do not have a female genital organ. And they laughed at me and they said, oh, you people like it that way. And I could see doctors giggling, nurses giggling. And this is all in government hospitals. Not everybody is that affordable that they can go to a private hospital and have their treatment, especially not a person like me. I can never think, even if I have to do something, I don't have that much money. And when today, after how many years of fight? 1850, the British brought in the law of Section 377. 6 September 2019, the law was removed. It is almost a 150 years of fight. And after that, we get a transgender bill, which is more discriminatory towards the whole community, and which in very little talks about the whole medical fraternity that has to come in. And it says that if I have to do my sex change surgery, I have to stand in a panel of 5 people, including a judge, psychiatric doctor, and I would have to be stripped naked. And looking at my body, they give the right to decide whether I need to go for a sex change surgery or no. So again, the question is where Kavita said, who owns my gender? How does these 5 people sitting there who do not know my life, who do not know who I'm comfortable with, decides that whether I should change my gender or no? Many of religious institutes are involved into counseling, are involved into, especially Catholic Institute. I'll also make that clear. And when a mother comes to a doctor, a psychiatric, a counselor, or whosoever and say, you know what, my child feels that he is a male, but he's interested into gay. And the time the doctor says, oh, you know, it's just a phase, it can be treated. Imagine the trauma that the child faces there. I did a survey, and this was interesting, and this is what the medical fraternity needs to know. I filed an RTI in one of the hospitals, government hospitals in Bombay, asking for how many people are treated under intersex condition. And the answer that I got was 0. Okay. And the answer that I got was 0. And I was a little shocked. I went back, I rephrased my RTI and I said, how many people are treated for hemorrhoid or chromosomal disorder? And I was zapped to know that in a government hospital, approximately 3,000 people are treated every day for such kind of conditions. So are you saying that when you have a majority of number like this, can this be called abnormal? Or this is the lack of education or the lack of medical fraternity that has failed to improve or bring in new concepts which they have failed to study with bodies. I will take a case of my own friend from Hyderabad, and my own case because I look like a male, but I have the eternal organ of a woman. And my first time to know me that I was intersex was when I went to my menstruation. And I was shocked that I didn't knew what this meant. Everybody thought it was piles, but it was not. And then there was a cyst found in my body. Then I became a part of the UN. And my friend who was born as a male, but while growing, you know, her genetical were both male and female. And she was used in an experiment. Her case is in Telangana. She was selected for the police, but because of her gender, she was not given the police post because she doesn't fits in the typical binary of male and female. And then finally, she has got a post now, but the police department is not releasing her post, though there is an order from the court. Similarly, there are 2 more incidents of Bonnie and Pinky from Calcutta, who played for national level football teams as male, but when their tests were done, they found out that they were intersex and they were not allowed to go further in their life struggle because it was put according to them that they cheated of being males. So how male becomes this superior gender, I don't understand, of just because you don't fix in the binary of being a male or a female. And why do I need to fix in this binary of being a male and female? Why can't my birth certificate have a column called as intersex? Why do we have, like Pooja said, this just the box of male and female? Why is there no other box of intersex? And this is the problem because, for example, they couldn't refix me. Many children who are born intersex are so-called refixed. And they don't even know that they are intersex. And when they grow up, you know, there is so much confusion because they don't know what their body is. And then parents suddenly is like, no, you are assigned to this gender, you need to stay to this gender. You cannot move forward. And the time we challenge these boxes, it becomes difficult at every step. Why? Because I have to see a doctor, I have to see a psychologist, I have to see a psychiatric, I have to see so many people there in that whole circle that I have to go round and round. But then I don't find anybody understanding me in that circle. I don't find anybody understanding me. Everybody will say, oh, you know, do a section surgery. Very good. Fine. Wear women clothes. Like I know some procedures of my friend where I've heard when they go to a section surgery, where, you know, the psychologist and the psychiatric tell them that 1 year wear women clothes, get out of the house, see how comfortable you feel. The question is not how comfortable I feel with my body. The question is how comfortable I feel with my mind. How comfortable when I go out there is not, I'm very happy with this body. I would love to roam like this day and night. But what about the trauma that would come out once I'm out there on the streets? It's very easy to say, you know, let them go off. No, it is not that easy to let them go off. It's an everyday struggle fighting with our core importance. And sometimes we don't want people to tell us what to do, but sometimes we want people to just listen to us. To listen to our struggles, to listen to what we go in our daily lives, so that you could understand us better. And as Pooja said, that experience is knowledge. For all doctors also, they need to listen so that they could experience our pain. And this is not empathy, but this is empathy. And we don't need sympathy on that part to tell us, oh, you know, things will be all right, because we know that things will never be all right. Many people from the age between, especially at the adolescent from 12 to 18, you know, when this is a crucial stage where I have termed this as the confusion between the body and the mind. You know, your body says that you're a male, but, you know, I feel like a female. Or your body says you're a man, but while your other friends are attracted toward the opposite gender, you are attracted towards the same gender. And they cannot take this pressure on them. And the suicide rate rises between this age, this very small gap of age, when they have just started living their lives. And because our own school system, our own counseling system, I'm sorry that even the new national education policy fails to highlight counseling and psychiatric as an important part of school fraternities. Fails to imply gender roles in one box and still is affirmed to only male and female. And this is where the whole problem starts. I know recent that, you know, online educations are going on, and one teacher abducted the whole subject of sex education and she said this subject is omitted. And when you have this kind of a mentality that is existing, how are we going to talk about positive sexuality? How are we going to talk about the variations and the beauties of human bodies? How are we going to say that, you know, male organ is beautiful, female organ is beautiful, LGBTIQ organ is beautiful? When are we going to learn to cherish human bodies, not from a scientific point of view, but from a human perspective point of view? And that is what I come back to Kavita ji's points, where we talk about Indian mythology, Indian history. We are so much focused on mandir and masjid, but why are we not focused on the sexual parts of the temples and the gods that we had, when we had so many LGBTIQ gods, right from Shrikhandi to Aravani to Mohini, and sorts of examples that are presented. And we know for the fact that India taught the world how to have sex through Kama Sutra. And you cannot get away from it. That's the fact. And we know for the fact that sex was not considered to be a taboo, but something that is divine, something that is spiritual, and something that was given to humans to enjoy to their fullest and without discrimination, basically. The person that we wanted to choose of being who we are. But over the times, I think I just read an ad yesterday and I wanted to share that pic. I would share it in the group where it said that समलैंगिक को ठीक किया जा सकता है आयुर्वेदिक दवा से. And this is a horrific fact of this society to understand that these are the same, like, you know, when a transgender is on out to prostitute, the people who raped me were not gays. The people who raped me were not so-called bisexual. The people who raped me were so-called heterosexual men who have wives and women at home and who went there to have sex with, and who also go out there having sex with women. And this is what happens in the name of medical fraternity. In Kerala, there is a concept, if I don't know if you have heard, it's called corrective rape. I don't know if you've ever heard this term. It's called corrective rape, where if a parents find out and where doctors have allegedly and knowingly given the family the right that if you do it this way, they will get cured. And what happens is if they find out that in your family, if anybody is gay or lesbian or bisexual or does not belong to the gender which is male and female, they ask one of the family members to rape you so that you can turn heterosexual. And this is a medical fraternity truth that many doctors have given accent to, that, you know, because a lesbian woman has never felt a man before, that is why she's confused. And if she feels a man, and if she has a man within herself, she will become heterosexual. And then I must not count on it, but the truth is till 2002 and before 2002, there were a lot of shock therapies that were given to LGBTIQ people, that were forceful hormone therapies that were injected in LGBTIQ people. And if that not was sufficient, there was rape that used to happen. Oh, so you like a dick, so, you know, take this, and a finger used to happen and all that stuff. So I think there is a time that we challenge these doctors who are illegally practicing something which can spoil a human mind. I stay in Bombay. And as I told you, Beena ji, before also, in Bombay, a sex change surgery can even cost you from 30 to 50,000. 30 to 50,000. And I know these small clinics who do it, who are not certified, but I still know that they do it. And why this business is on leash, because one side you don't have a money. You know, a person like me cannot afford 2 lakhs to go to a big hospital and do it. But on the other hand, I just feel like a woman and I go to these surgeries, my complete, this thing goes away. What is it called? My health decreases, and then there's no medical fertility, and many trans women and trans men die just because of not attending a proper surgery, medical surgery. So why don't we question the whole Mediclaim fraternity who takes so much money? Why sex, I don't use the word sex change surgery. I even don't like the word gender affirmation surgery. But if sex change surgeries need to be done, why don't Mediclaim brings a view and employs these systems to make it more inclusive? Because inclusivity does not come from big talks. Inclusivity comes from real action on field. And how we train doctors, not just gynecologists, not just psychologists, psychiatrists, but the whole medical fraternity, that when I walk in your room, you make me feel comfortable. You make me feel the way I am. You make me cherish me the way I am. And you treat me the way I want to be treated, not the way you want me to be treated. So I think with that, I will close my remarks, opening remarks, and take this forward. Thank you.
Hi, Daniel. Thank you so much for sharing your story. And I apologize. I apologize on behalf of the medical fraternity, on behalf of the society. Medical fraternity is part of society, right? As much as we would want to believe that medical fraternity should know better, we don't know better. We have the same trappings that every member in the society does. So we have an equal number of doctors who probably don't understand what is going on at all, and our medical education does not equip us with the tools to develop the sensitivity to even open up to things that we are not used to, or listen to try with the intention to understand your side of the story. And I apologize to you sincerely, the pain and trauma that you've been through. And it's great that you've channeled all that energy to turn into an advocate. And I hope that in your lifetime, we manage to change something for somebody. I'm sorry. So moving to, again, why are so many doctors not aware of what's going on at all? About 6 or 8 months ago, we had a national conference of endocrinologists, and we had a Meet the Professor session on how to manage individuals who have gender identity discordance, right? And we were surprised, and endocrinology is, along with psychiatry, the stream of medical fraternity who are likely to be the experts in knowing how to handle this situation or guide our patients through this whole maze, right? And we were astonished to find that only 10 or 20% of the total fraternity of endocrinologists in the country were even willing to have a conversation or engage with individuals with gender identity. Forget about intersex, right? Intersex is a whole another space in itself, and very few endocrinologists received training. Less than 5% percentage of endocrinologists received training in this field while they finished their endocrinology degrees. Very similar to what Dr. Kavita told us, that you can finish psychiatry and not even know the ropes of how to go about this and handle it with care and handle it with empathy, as you've brought about. So I have a very similar story during my DM program, and I trained in a government college in Kolkata, where I had a person who identified herself as himself as a male, who walked in and said, they told me that a hormone specialist is the one I should meet, and I come from a rural West Bengal, and help me. And this was the first time I was meeting somebody who had this issue, and there was nobody, none of my faculty, none of my professors had any experience in treating it. So I had to honestly tell her, you know what, I do not know how this works, but we're going to figure it out. And that's when I knew that how could it be that the specialty, which is supposed to be the knocking point for patients or persons to come in to seek help or try and figure out the situation, not know what to do in this situation. So that's how my journey started. And of course, we understand that in the space that I am at, that we are not treating anything at all. And as Danielle has so beautifully explained herself, that this is a disconnect between what's happening in your mind, what you identify in your soul as yourself, and the discordance with probably the physical attributes in your body. And as an endocrinologist, I'm only here to try and reduce the discomfort that you feel with your physical attributes. I have a good set of people who identify themselves as transgender male or female, who want only very few changes. For example, some are just unhappy with the hair on their face and they just want that removed. Some just want some changes in their breast and they're okay with it. And some people want to go all out and get gender affirming surgery done as well. But my job is to just find out what it is that they want to feel fuller, more complete, more like themselves, and to go out and lead fuller lives, and for me to help them do that safely. As Danielle has pointed out, there are numerous stories of how numerous medical catastrophes can happen because we are dealing with potent hormonal medications, right? And these medications come with their baggage of increased risk of blood clots, increased risk of heart attacks, and all of that. You have stories of numerous people who do get these adverse effects, and my job is that to make sure that this treatment is safe for you. And as Dr. Kavita pointed out, and I can't do any of this without being an advocate, without being an ally, without being the person who's watching out for you, without being the person who's telling the urologist that this is not some place where you decide what the surgery needs to be or you decide how it is to be done. This is a place where you need to keep the conversation open and you let them decide what it is that they want. You don't decide if you're going to do a vaginoplasty, a clitoroplasty. That not based, this is not a puzzle that you're trying to solve and fix. It's not that, right? It's about catering to what the person in front of you wants for themselves. It's a tough conversation. It is, and I will never be able to understand everything that what you're saying from my perspective. But like I said, this is an extremely, I don't feel nervous very often, but this conversation is something that I was nervous about, because I'm really not, my intention is not to offend at all. And I know that it's so easy to offend, and I understand where you're coming from. So much hurt has been unloaded on you, even before you step into my room. I know that already. And it would be impossible to expect that you will not be defensive when you're interacting with me. So I'm extremely watchful of the hurt that we can do to you, and willing to change. Also, we are now beginning to have plans and conversations about fertility, right? For so long, this fight has been so much about just convincing people that, you know what, I'm normal, just can you just get with it and make me feel more at home in this body that I'm trapped in, that we've forgotten to speak about fertility and need to, you know, have children. So now we are opening up conversations, speaking about fertility options, and many people appreciate that completely. And coming to the section of intersex, if gender identity is an unknown topic or less known topic amongst endocrinologists, intersex is even poorly understood, very poorly understood. It's kind of mixed up in this whole situation of medical diagnosis, and so the production of hormones related to gender, be it testosterone, estrogen, very closely sync up with numerous other hormones which are essential for life. Let's say glucocorticoids, mineralocorticoids. And I feel the medical fraternity is just obsessed with that aspect of hormonal pathways, and completely not address this situation at all. Honestly speaking, Daniel, we don't know at all how to handle it. We don't know at all how to handle, let us say, a child who's born with genitalia which cannot be clearly categorized by us as male, female, which we at least have now come to. I feel intersex itself is derogatory in some term, but because we don't have another word, we're going to use that word. That we don't really know how to manage, because it's a child, right? How are you, like you said, I could have assigned a child who has a genitalia which is ambiguous as male, but he might grow up to think that I don't identify myself as a male. I in my head, I'm female. So it is a very confusing space. And I know we failed you as the specialists or the experts or the medical fraternity, but let me tell you, conversations are on. We are pushing for greater awareness. We are pulling up people for behaving better. We are pulling up people for watching our language. We are pulling up people for being more empathetic. We are bringing in norms to make sure that we include your voice, because this is about you. This is not about us. This is not a chapter that I can write by myself in my textbook and I talk about it with my people. This is about you, to make this an inclusive space, to include you and your voice in this. And I'm hoping that we meet again a couple of decades from now with things being much more different, and I can tell you that some of the positive change that you brought about. Thank you so much for sharing your story, Daniel, and I sincerely apologize.
I think this is quite silence, and I think I'll break this silence. I think nobody needs to apologize. It is how all of our upbringings are, which has destroyed, patriarchy has destroyed all of us at the end of the day. Let's be honest to it. But I think, yes, there's a lot need to work more closely with people who are so-called so-called and are gods in some eyes, like doctors are given that priorities of gods, and we'll not take away that from them. But even God make mistakes. Even gods make mistakes. Look at, they created human beings. So of course they did the biggest one. So I think we all make mistakes and we learn. Such kind of a conversations helps us build this bonding between us, because I think, as I said before on Kavita ji's picture, that stories have the power to change the world. Stories have the power to see a new beginning, and stories are something that Indian culture roots have helped us right from independence to removing of Section 377 out from this country. And we hope to see a better world with better medical fraternity, and moreover an inclusive world where everybody can access to without fearing of just entering into a doctor's room and saying, hey, listen, you know what, it's normal to be gay, it's normal to be queer, just get away with it.
I think that to have Pooja start our next round, right, Veena?
Okay. So round 2 now, is it? So first of all, again, just feeling very overcome by so many things that were shared, so many such incredibly important positions have been taken. I mean, we are not discussing hormones here. We are talking incredibly political things here. And, when Dr. Chitra gave, apologized and gave that sort of offer, that apology, I was also thinking that maybe that's an opportunity to, just vicariously live that apology and live that moment, because I don't think it is coming to any of us ever. So I also found that to be a moment where something which cannot even be expected has just come our way. And I don't know if Daniel also experiences it as that, but I felt that in the moment, even though I know that it's not directed at me, but it's also, like I said, vicariously just living that apology. So thank you very much for all of your statements. And I will I thought I'll just say again a few things, not just in response, but also to take some things forward, to also stretch some of our questions and some of our definitions. And I was thinking about the part where Daniel spoke of babies getting fixed. I was thinking there is such enthusiasm to do non-consensual surgeries on babies. And when an adult trans person is consensually seeking surgery, that is the moment you choose to say, no, we decide. So I don't think that we have even understood how, the value of consent. So as I said earlier, when we are talking self-determination, we also will uphold consent then and say that if non-consensual surgeries are seen as okay and consensual surgeries are seen as something that needs to be stopped, and therefore also the instinct to preserve, perhaps, that I think is taught or is part of the framework of medical sciences, where you have to preserve the body, the pristineness or the purity of the body, as it were, and that comes in the way of you offering something that an individual is seeking of you, that that you have the expertise to provide, but you will then turn this into a matter of preserving bodies. It is that moment you choose to just disregard consent and disregard self-determination and make it about, the purity of bodies, not realizing that we are also talking lives. We're also talking people. We're talking emotions. We're talking distress. We are talking life and death situations even then, even when it's about self-determination. And also when I was hearing the doctors here talk, and the kind of reflection that has gone into this, into investigating the social in the medical, I think that's the only way that you will see yourselves as advocates or allies. there is, unless the social in the medical is unpacked. Otherwise, I'm sure even, I mean, Dr. Chadda would have more to also say about this in terms of the inherent biases in objective sciences. And unless those are questioned or understood, or the social is implicated in the medical, there's no way we will even consider that the role of the doctor as advocate, or doctor as ally, or practitioner as ally actually is important when we talk lives on the margins. Because we are talking about a gap, and sorry, not a gap like this, but a hierarchical gap actually. And so I would, now having talked about consent and self-determination, I just wanted to briefly flag an issue that could require further dialogue, that could require more conversations, but just to flag it here. And that is the, in the current Trans Act, doctors are an important cog in the wheel. The doctors or the medical practitioners are going to provide certification, are going to provide the stamp that helps a trans person acquire their status as humans, as the gender that they identify. And this means that the medical the medical, I shouldn't even say fraternity, because I am speaking to two women identified doctors, and I will say that the medical field perhaps
perhaps community, if you'd like.
Medical community, yes. Medical community is a good word. So yeah, another very inherent unthought bias in our language as well. I remember in one of the trainings, I was trying to tell a doctor that perhaps we should say chest instead of breast when we were talking about a trans person's dysphoria, a trans man's dysphoria, and how breast is a word that has it's just so heavy with meanings of womanhood and motherhood. And I was trying to sort of facilitate a reflection on the word breast, and perhaps why don't we just say chest instead? And unfortunately, the response I got at that time from the doctor was that, well, they are technically very different. You know, so at that point, the upholding of the medical over the person, the medical over the individual, was a very stark moment of, I mean, great distress actually. What the Trans Act might end up doing is putting, it means that the medical community will be colluding with state violence. Let me just put it as bluntly as that. The medical community is going to support state in certification of trans people. Yeah? And that perhaps is a moment for the community to ask of themselves that, are we okay being part of this extremely violent system? The law is not just about the courts and the lawyers. The medical community is going to be heavily implicated in state violence because of the Trans Act. And then what are the questions that the community will ask of themselves and of the state and of everybody else? Because this will also not be upholding consent or self-determination. Yeah, so to just sort of center ourselves or ground ourselves in certain values, because that's what we'll keep coming back to. These are not legal dilemmas. I'm talking about ethical dilemmas. And if we have ethical dilemmas that require ethical resolutions outside of the legal and the medical, it will need us to answer some very, very difficult questions. So I think I'm also very, very happy to hear the part about acknowledgement of biases, and that being fundamental to any form of shift. I mean, if there is no acknowledgement of bias or an admission of bias, there is, I don't know where we will go from here, as an imperative to any form of conversation. On the note, and I was also, I mean, these are moments where your individual defensiveness can get triggered. You know, these are times as practitioners, we can have an individual defensive response to very political questions. And in those moments, perhaps to ground yourself by saying that what we are talking about is marginalized lives. Yeah. We're talking about real lives. We are not talking fictions. We are talking real pain. We're talking real distress. We're talking real lives. And that's how you come back to what is important, because this is not just, you know, you and me fighting over what is right or what is wrong. We're talking about lives here. And all of us largely are committed to well-being of the people we work with. So just to sort of come back to that. And on the topic of terminology, because I think that might be something to take up, or maybe not, to just say that there is, when we say self-determination, there's a certain politics behind terminology as well. That we uphold the margins and their names for themselves. Yeah, there has been much, even in the feminist movement, there has been much reclaiming of words like slut and all, and because it was thrown as a slur and then the movement reclaimed it. Similarly, the word queer was extremely stigmatized when it first came into use. The word hijra, in our own context, hijra was a pejorative word, and then the community reclaimed itself and says we self-describe as hijras now. So in terms of language also, are we going to top-down label, or are we going to listen to how people are describing themselves? What are the labels that speak of pride and not stigma? What are the labels that speak of normal and not abnormality? So what are the ways in which we describe ourselves? And that's also the important part about knowledge, about language, about terminologies. And of course, this also, let's also realize that if we want to label the margins, we definitely should have labels for the center. We should definitely have labels for the normal, because the quote unquote normal or the quote unquote default escapes naming. So we will say cis, we will say heterosexual. And if we are not, we will say other things. Yeah, so I think naming the normal, questioning what's normal, what's abnormal, all of these will just be continuous, very, very continuous processes. So I think this is all I had at this point to share. Very, very heartening actually to be in this space. Thank you all.
I'll take over there from Pooja with many, many thoughts running through my mind, but a lot of gratitude right now that I'm feeling for having the conversation that we are having today. And I think, Daniel, at the same time that Chitra apologized, the same words were going through my mind as well, that as sometimes the space in which events occur, we are all part of that space. We are the witnesses, we are the spectators. Often we don't identify with the person who's actually going through the journey because we consider ourselves the space. And that brings me to what Pooja is saying, that do we truly own this concept of we? Why do we need to cherish a diverse world? It's not about you and me. It's not about them and us. I think till we are able to say we as together and not just only point out that there are marginalized communities and non-marginalized communities, I think till we are actually able to come to the crux of why do we really need to cherish a diverse world? What's the importance of that? And so I think that thought has stayed with me from our discussion today, that can I put words to that? The language is so important. Why do we not talk about everybody else's non-homosexual people? Why is the world, well, you're a non-transgender? And would that be empowering to say, yeah, look at all these non-homosexual people? And how is that going to be received? So I think that brings me to the concept of language. And I think that's something that's so important. And I do believe language is performative. We perform when we are speaking. And in our local languages, for example, in Hindi or whatever, the translation from transgender is so different. The translation from queer is so different. In our local languages, often there is no word which is culturally and contextually a descriptor. So I've attended many forums in which often the people who identify themselves, they say, we don't want to be accorded any name. It's okay. We prefer not to be. Because in the context that I'm meeting you, that's not important. My gender or my sexual preference, just not important. So why do you need to know it? And I think the true respect on our parts would be, yes, where you prefer to, please go ahead. Where you do not prefer to, there's no need for it. And balancing this, and where and how do we balance this conversation, is often something that I find as a dilemma. Where is the language? Where is the knowledge? Where to go to check in with, what am I doing right now? How can I reflect on it? So I think one of the gaps I often find, which is why I'm so grateful for the conversation and the space created today, is that the fora created, or the spaces for these dialogues, are so few and far between, that how does the medical fraternity watching this, and I'm limiting myself to the medical community right now, because I think that is the intent. The target audience is not just the common public. It's very important to target right now the medical community. Yeah, and I consider myself as one of the people representing it. But where does one go to actually check, am I doing this in a way that is respectful or not? Am I doing this in keeping with recent advances or not? Am I doing this in a way that is culturally contextual? So I feel and deeply miss the absence of such spaces. And I do think that one of the things going forward that I would really like to recommend is the building of such spaces, right from the word go, right from the point of time a child is born. And I think this is what, so I'm a child and mental health professional, child and adolescent mental health professional. So I work more often now with children than adults. And I realize that there are no role models, not in children's literature, not in the toys and action figures that come, not in the movies that children watch, not in the stories they are told, not in the stories they read, not in the school they go to. It is talked about how many boys are in this class, how many girls are in this class. It is talked about, this is a boys' school, this is a girls' school. Right from there, we do not have the language, we do not have a model, we do not have the framework. And often, small things which appear small, but suppose our forms and birth certificates had assigned gender instead of gender. Suppose we had that, so that right from the beginning, the conversation has started. I don't own your gender, little one. I am assigning a gender for want of that knowledge. When you grow up, you will figure out your preferred gender. Starting and opening that dialogue, for example, whether in the legal or the social or whatever space. I think these are things which also are hugely important if we are looking at it from the point of view of, so a hospital, when you enter a hospital or a mental health institution or any place, all places have a demographic data collection. How many of them give a box? And why is it male, female, and other? So I think it's points like that. It's what to do from that point of view, which also defines the space around which we grow. And from the point, so I'm going to stop there from the social aspect, but because I also do want to talk about what Pooja, you've brought up, and Daniel, you've brought up about the trans bill and where that locates a medical professional right now. So I'm often approached, and this I'm speaking from personal experience, I'm often approached for these certifications, even now, and before the trans bill was talked about as much. And I find myself trying to bridge that dilemma every time I'm approached. And that's again where the dilemma is, am I owing my allegiance at that point of time in that consult to the individual sitting in front of me who needs to get on with their life? Or am I going to say, I will not do this because I believe this is wrong to write. If I don't write this certificate in the language that is told by the system right now, am I obstructing the journey of this individual? And these are the dilemmas that I, as a mental health professional, I go through every time. And I've tried different things. More recently, I consulted with many of the young people who come to me and say, what do you think we can do about it? I don't want to write this. I do not want to write gender identity disorder. I don't want to write the word disorder. However, you're not going to be able to go to the Gazette and get this done if I don't write that. So one of them said to me, and I'm giving you an example, write incongruence, write dissonance. They didn't get a certification and they went to the Gazette. And they came back. So now I write 2 letters. One letter which does not say disorder and one which says disorder. And I say, use whichever one is feasible in whichever context you're in, because it is so contextual. The other thing I tried was, and this is with a young person who's in their early 20s, and they needed it for their college because they wanted an accommodation. They identified themselves as female, but they were being given a male accommodation, because even in residential colleges, there is a male versus female accommodation. Unisexual accommodation sometimes are not present in it. And they said, I want the female accommodation, but I need a certification from you. This is neither for my name hasn't been changed. I'm entering this college. So I said, can we co-sign a letter? The system needs it from me, but I believe that gender is self-determined. So we made a letter which she signed and I signed. Do you know what happened in the college? They refused to accept the letter. Although the mental health individual and the counselor of that college said, that's a great idea. But for their records, they needed something which had my stamp and did not need to include. So I think that dilemma is very real for the person trying to bridge that dilemma as well. And the allegiance to the person who's sitting in front of me, and with the knowledge of the distress and the journey. Am I adding value to that journey right now? Or am I just being an advocate and an ally and being an activist for the larger movement? So I think this is a dilemma that I do face very often, because I have tried to adopt the position of an advocate and an ally sometimes. But this bridge is very difficult. And my only way of co-creating a solution is on a person-to-person basis. I sit with them and there have been people who said, just write disorder, talk and sign it. Don't worry about it. I don't weigh my gender basis this letter. But I know we need to get on with it. So you write it, you sign it in front. I write the letter in front of them, make them read it before I stamp and sign it, and they take it away. So I think what I'm trying to say is sometimes language also has a context, and sometimes positions can be a double-edged sword. And I think it's not just the individual who's navigating this interface, it's also the medical profession that's navigating the interface. And I think this being on both sides can be extremely difficult, which I think is one of the reasons the medical community often takes a black or a white stance, because we like to compartmentalize. That's what we've been taught and trained to do. Find the deficit as much as possible. Don't live in the gray zone. And I do think that mentally that's what a medical professional often is trying to do. But the need for the grays exists, the need for the spectrum exists, the need for non-categorization exists. We need to make spaces for that. We don't seem to have spaces for that right now. There's small, few, far between. But yeah, I'm thankful for this space. And I would like to join Chitra in apologizing from the point of view of a spectator. It evoked a lot in me, Daniel. I mean, I've been privileged to be witness to many journeys. I've worked with a lot of people who have, I wouldn't say a lot, I think that's a qualitative or a relative term. And I've had the privilege to witness the courage of each and every story. I think I can safely say that a lot of my inspiration to continue doing the work that I do has come from the stories of the individuals that have sat in that room with me and been vulnerable. That has given me the power to be vulnerable too. And I am constantly inspired. And I would say that to all the medical professionals who are watching this, that you will not have a more enriching, rewarding experience than this. I think it has enriched me as a human being. I think it widens my horizons every day. And I hope I continue to be in a space where I can actually continue with the self-reflection and reflective practices as well. So with that, I'd like to conclude maybe. And I think one of the questions that I do wish to address for all of us today is to actually arrive at a few things which talk about language, a few things that talk about what can I do in the capacity and context that I am in. So, I mean, from my side, my intention right now is to carry on with recent advances in medical literature, but also to look at Indian traditions, and number 3, to learn from lived experiences, because that's where the true expertise is. As an advocate or as an ally, I think more recently, not before, although I've been working since 2006 in a gender clinic, I have often not gone beyond the one-to-one. I've often not written about it. I've often not necessarily felt that I need to sort of go out in the public and talk about it more. It's only in the last couple of years that I feel that I've started talking about it more, beyond the medical aspects of it, that is. And I intend to carry on doing that. I think it exposes each one of us a little bit more. I think it exposes the vulnerability as well as the inadequacy of knowledge. And I think that's what often keeps one from going in that direction. But I'm pledging today that I will carry on, make the mistakes that need to be made, and expose myself to the pointing of fingers a little bit more than usual, and say that this is a fight we all have to fight. Thank you.
I think it's my turn now, and I didn't know that this session would take a turn like this from where we started.
Daniel, can I interrupt?
Yes, please.
So I think you should have the last word in this conversation. Okay, so if you'll allow me, I'll say my 2 piece and I'll take my pledge for you, and then you can have the concluding remarks. Are you okay with that?
I'm okay with that. There's
okay,
no
sorry.
problem. I've adjusted everything in life.
Sorry, I made you adjust again, Daniel. Thank you, Pooja, for asking those extremely difficult questions. I cannot even fathom to see how I could be the person to answering it. And thank you, Dr. Kavita, for accepting all our deficits and fallacies and being willing to be so vulnerable, and Daniel for forcing us to sit up and not treat this as just another thing that we do in our lives, and to pay more attention to it. And I'm an optimist, and I'm going to paint this picture of hope for you, and I'm hoping that soon in our lifetime we see a day where we believe all that our children have to say, and then we as adults are okay to have a conversation with our adolescents when they tell us about the gender they identify. I think all of this will be so much easier if we just believed what the children and adolescents told us, right? All that angst, all that distress could be avoided, and then there is no need for surgeries to undo what puberty did to our bodies, right? So I think I envision a day where we're willing to have that conversation, not suspect that maybe this adolescent is confused or going through a phase, and believe them when they tell us, and not have the need to go meet a psychiatrist to get a certificate, and let the person blossom to be what he or she identifies with. And I'm hoping that we'll see that day very soon. Daniel, over to you.
As I said before, I didn't know that this session would go from where to touching hearts of each one of us. And I wish I could meet, and this is honestly that beautiful minds of doctors like you in my life, which was not possible, but henceforth I see a opening to the coming generation that I think we all have fought for. Maybe every story has it, maybe Pooja or me or anybody sitting here. What we have gone through, our only hope is that the coming generation doesn't go through. And that brings me to the allyship of doctors. And allyship cannot be anytime in the hidden. Allyship cannot be in the closet. Allyship means it has to be open, it means it has to be out, and it means that if there is another fraternity who's treating LGBTI people differently, it is the part of that doctor's allyship to say, hey, listen, you know what, you're doing something wrong. And this needs to be changed. Current situation also, this is what I want to tell you and want to know, even in this COVID situation with the world, how much data do we really have of how many LGBTIQ people are there in that centers? And what are they facing in those centers? Because I have heard stories of trans people not just getting admitted in Bombay because they are trans and because there is no separate ward. And we have not even touched that yet. And we don't even know the history and data into this political view of how these people are being treated. One experience is very important to share. I was working with JJ Hospital I did my bachelor's in social work. So one of my field assignment, I was working with the Chirag NGO that worked with AIDS. And since this has been a terminology for years that because of LGBTIQ people, AIDS became more prominent in this country or in the world, I have seen how when they go to take ART medicines, okay, this is the logic, a simple thing of ART medicine, where the person who's giving them medicine is not a medical fraternity and is like it holds like an administration position, but forces that trans women to say कि लड़के के कपड़े पहन के आओ तभी ही आपको दवाई दी जाएगी. And how have doctors have refused that when they die, you know, when they are dead, how they are not even treated as humans at the time of death. And this is the story of a recent, I think, Hyderabad or Telangana, where the whole trans community came together and wrote a letter because the doctors were not released to give the body of the guru for the cremation because they wanted to do a so-called research to understand what her body or what their body looked like. So these are these traumatic stories that come, and this brings us to what allyship really means. And allyship really means is standing for each other's rights. And it is not just LGBTIQ rights. It is where LGBTIQ becomes an ally for heterosexual person and where a heterosexual person becomes an ally for LGBTIQ community. Because that's how freedom is. Freedom is not a concept of individual, but freedom is a concept of dependent. My freedom depends on your thoughts and your thoughts depends on my freedom. And that's how it has to work. And in future Lifeline, I hope that there is a lot of work that we do where we in two simple words, when we have conferences, when we have doctor conferences, it is very important that we have representations of the community, because that's how it makes you reach to a larger crowd. Because, you know, oh, what are you talking about? Are you talking about these intersex people? You know, they inka roz ka rona dhona hai. But unless and until they don't listen to what we have to go through, just because maybe you're inaugurant, just because of my skin is, we will never be able to understand and initiate this dialogue. And this is where brings me to the most important part of one incident with Madurai. Madurai became the first state of the entire India where the High Court of Madurai banned intersex surgeries of children and said that it said that, you know, this is a human right and this surgery needs to be banned. Hence, there were no guidelines, which will come later on. But this is a type of awareness that we require when we look at the trans bill, when we look at the policy making. Because unless and until, like, I believe this, and this is what is my experience, that anything in India that is unwritten is unsaid. You know, you will never be able to practice if it is not written. So there is this need where we question the medical team to change their ideologies, to change the syllabus. Changing the syllabus is not as important as changing the mind of the fraternity. Because once this mind is clear, syllabus will automatically take its turn to change. Because this is how the doctors will question. And how how the marginalized sector, when I'm talking about marginalized sector, I'm not just talking about LGBTIQ, but I'm also talking about LGBTIQ marginalized sector who falls under the below the poverty line. And how come government accessibility can be become more responsible? How do we make government hospitals more responsible for taking up these ideologies and breaking their stereotypes as looking at LGBTIQ people? Now, for example, for me, there is only one doctor I can go through because I cannot approach any other doctor with the fear of how, this doctor is going to treat me. So I have a family doctor who I go through, and I can openly be who I am. And he is the one who takes care, like suppose I got admitted for typhoid. He made sure, he called all the hospital there and said, you know what, you do not discriminate this person. And if you do so, I will be the one who will be taking the first action. So that gave me a sense of comfortability to go and get admitted myself as a person, because I was assured that no matter if this person is there, I know my doctor who's there will help me out. So it's not the role with LGBTIQ people of doctor doesn't ends in that room, but actually begins from that room. Begins from the time when I come for counseling to the time I chose to become who I am. Because if you look at this body structure, I must not say this, but this is a truth, and this is harsh truth, and this is, I think, what I have been known for is my blunt honesty that I bring to the table, is that there is so much money making with the LGBTIQ people in the out fraternity. Right from a laser treatment to the hormones, to your sex change surgeries and XYZ things, but still we are considered to be the second-class citizens of this country. And this is where this problematic starts, where the first thing that I have told, the first thing that comes with medical fraternity is, oh, it's a gender identity disorder. And again, I come to that point, when it becomes a disorder, that means it needs to be treated. And those treatment can be XYZ, starting from whatsoever procedures I have to go through. But nobody makes me say that you can still be comfortable in the body you're born with. And that's where the problem, I think, majority of is, where the society wants you to be defined. Okay, you're a trans, you decide whether male or whether female. You can't be in that between and say, oh, you are a man and you can dress like a woman. No, that binary sentences, they're not accepted. Though we'll accept Krishna as a god who is the most feminine part of nature, who will have all kinds of jewelry on him, the perfect eyeliner that I could ever see on a woman's eyes, the beautiful kajal on his eyes, the nice pile, in his legs, and the way he holds his basuri, the most feminine type. But feminine people with male identities will not be accepted in the society. And this is the hypocrisy. And one more important thing is, I don't even blame the doctors, because there is one aspect in all of this that we forgot to talk, is even doctors believe in some religion. And that's how religion has also impacted them to think in an ideology, to discriminate people in society. It's though funny how science and religion goes together hand in hand in this country. But yes, because of the faith that they have got, in one side is a fraternity, one side is their doctor degree, which tells them that discrimination without caste, gender, religion for humanity, and one side there is religion. And since India has been always religion and doctorate together, I will never hear a foreign doctor any saying कि अब तो सब भगवान के हाथ में है. This is only in India where we listen कि अब हमने जो करना था कर दिया, अब सब ऊपर वाले के हाथ में है. So this faith keeps people go alive, but they forget with this part that faith also plays a role in discrimination. Faith also plays a role in bringing someone's rights down. And I think it is okay to believe in faith. But when I'm a doctor, when I'm wearing that coat, for me, what is most important is scientific view. For me, what is more important is the human that stands in front of me is more beyond than gender. because my one decision, your one decision, the doctor's one decision is going to change the entire life circle of that person. And I have met that one doctor when I walked into her room, and she said, when she welcomed me, and the first thing she said to me was just one word. She said, "You are not abnormal. You are as much as human as I am." And that gave me the courage to stand back in my life, fight for myself, and come to this level of coming out. It is not easy to come out to what I shared today, but this courage is come from a doctor to me, from a doctor who understood me. And one more suggestion, that when people are hearing this, you need to write a medical book from the perspective of queer perspectives. We don't want doctors to write on behalf of us. We want us to write and tell you our stories. So according to that stories, you come out and go ahead with your medical examinations. You find out ways for us how to deal with such aspects. If I tell you I'm intersex, I am ready to give you my body. I'm ready to conduct any kind of survey. But the question is with dignity and with respect. The final statement is that when I come to your clinic, you treat me as a human, you give me my human rights. You don't make fun of me. When I say that I'm not comfortable doing this, don't do it with me. Please don't do it with me. Ask me what are my pronouns. Ask me how I would like to be treated. Don't treat me the way you want me. Like, we have always heard that treat people the way you want to be treated. I say, no, that's the wrong statement. Treat people the way they want to be treated. I don't want to be treated the way as a heteronormative. No, that's not. And my closing word is thank you. Thank you, Beenaji. Thank you, Kavitaji. Thank you, Geetaji. Thank you, Chitraji. And thank you, Pooja, for giving us this opportunity to talk today, because the most biggest fear of my life, talking to doctors, has today vanished. And I could see a future ahead to come where there is humanity seen over gender, where there is equality before discrimination, and moreover, the values of Constitution, which is based on equality, freedom, may be enjoyed by every one of us, irrespective of who we are. Because freedom is not a concept, again I'm saying, freedom is not a concept of individual. Freedom is a concept that is dependent upon you. My freedom depends upon you, and your freedom depends upon me. And the time it snatches away, life falls apart. And LGBTIQ life is not as easy to live. Not everybody of us is not easy. We go through all sort of things every day, but I think we go to a little bit more to be ourselves, because sexuality is personal. Sex is very personal. Who I want to be with bed is a choice, but gender is open. That's why we say it's a social contract. I cannot hide it. I have to go out there, and I have to use as many words. And there brings me to Kavita's G's topic, that language, the core foundation of talking and the core foundation of interaction. If that becomes inclusive, if that becomes understandable, we will have a better world to live in. And I don't think it's a difficult when we can reach Mars and Moon and, create coronavirus and go to beyond things which human world cannot have imagined. I don't think it's difficult to understand gender and sexuality in that terms. And that's my last word. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.